Good morning once again, colleagues. My name is Kosietu from the Research Capacity Development Unit at the Postgraduate School. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's session. I would like to thank all of you for taking your time to attend this session. And I would like to thank Dr. Smart for joining us and taking her time to facilitate today's session. Just some quick housekeeping rule. This workshop is being recorded and all the resources, which includes the recording as well as the presentation slide, will be shared to your Moodle community. Please do use the raise hand button if you do have a question for Dr. Smart, or use the chat box if you do have any question. You are allowed to pause her at any point should you have any question. Colleagues, allow me to introduce our facilitator for today. Dr. Letitia Smart is a senior lecturer in the University of Johannesburg Department of Sociology. Dr. Smart has been teaching research methodology on postgraduate and undergraduate levels for over 16 years and has been supervising postgraduate students for the same amount of time. She is a Desmond Tutu scholar who completed her doctoral studies at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Her scholar papers have been published in several esteemed international journals such as Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Sexualities, the Journal of Homosexuality, and the Journal of Sociology and Anthropology. Dr. Smart has also served on the South African Sociological Association in various capacities, including as a councillor member from 2009 to 2011. Dr. Smart currently holds the position of SASA co-working group convener for the Lesbian, Gay and Queer Studies working group. Thank you so much once again, colleagues and Dr. Smart, for taking your time. We hope this workshop will be beneficial to all of us. Thank you once again. Dr. Smart, you can proceed with the session. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that introduction. Do you mind if I share my slides?
Please do share, Dr. Smart. I will stop sharing mine now.
Great. All right, can everybody see my slides? We're good?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Perfect, perfect. I would just like to reiterate, thank you so much for everybody who's joined in today. As my bio basically mentioned, I've been involved in methodology teaching on undergraduate and postgraduate level for a number of years. I think I've been blessed to work in a department that has also allowed me to co-supervise when I was an early career lecturer and researcher. And I think with co-supervision, it really allowed me to engage with more experienced supervisors and to see what works and also what doesn't work. So over a number of years, I think I've also just kind of collected a bunch of guidelines or tips rather on what works and what doesn't work, and that is what I will be sharing here today. So in particular, my own research comes from qualitative research designs. I have engaged with mixed methods approaches. I have done only quantitative studies as well. But again, I think it's always important to realize that the topic really also guides the methodological choices that students and we as researchers make. So my work usually centers around gendered identities, sexual identities, issues around stigma and heteronormativity. So for me, qualitative research has also always been a nice fit. And that is why I always get really excited when I'm working with students who wants to engage with qualitative research. So in today's workshop, I will be looking at some guidelines on how to supervise qualitative studies. And I will do so by starting with step one, how we can help students design a qualitative study. Also looking into the logic behind data collection methods. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of the logic around each data collection method, because I mean, that would be a workshop on its own, but I am going to share some tips in terms of how to guide students, and then also some data analysis strategies, how to write up the methodology chapter, and then how to actually present qualitative data and findings. I think that is where a lot of students always get stuck as well. And I know that there are people here from other disciplines. My discipline is sociology, but qualitative research really deals with human subjects. And I know even in business, communications, education, I mean, these are areas where students will be engaging in qualitative research. So I'm hoping that this session will be helpful in terms of giving some insights. So I'm going to start at the real beginning. That's where every story really starts. And that is when you first meet your student. And I'm mostly going to speak about my experiences with master's and PhD students. Um, and I've successfully helped students graduate, I think about 16 or 18 master students. I only recently got my PhD in 2020, so my first PhD student graduated this year, and I've got 4 others submitting in October. So it's going to be a busy year for me, but I want to reflect on where it really should all start, what really works for me, and that is meeting the student and excuse me, guiding them to choose a fitting research topic. So what I mean by fitting is I usually invite the students that I meet to, in their own words, without using academic jargon, I invite them to just share with me what research topic idea do they have in mind. I want to do this because this is essentially their work. As a supervisor, I play a mentorship role and a guidance role, as I've mentioned. So I want their authentic voices to come through. And oftentimes it is during these initial conversations that I get a sense of where the student want to go with their studies. Sometimes they don't even know yet. But remember, a supervisor is somebody who is slightly more an expert, for instance, in the field, and they can actually guide the student to kind of refine their research topic. So many times as well, I do come across students who tell me that they would like to, for instance, generalize to a larger population, in which case I would then say to them, okay, so you want to do a quantitative study. Because it's in these initial conversations that I can actually pinpoint the type of methodological approach they would also like to take. Sometimes students say, no, I don't want to generalize. I said, okay, but it's the words you are using and how you are phrasing it. So let's think about this clearly. What is a qualitative study? What is a qualitative design? I mean, qualitative research is more about understanding something. It's more about providing insights into meanings that people, for instance, attach to certain phenomena. And with quantitative, there we want to measure, there we will be looking at cause and effect relationships, or whether or not there is a significant relationship between 2 variables. So if that is the case and the student really wants to follow that route, I would advise them to do a quantitative study. However, if they are more interested in really understanding a phenomenon in more depth, then I will guide them into a qualitative study. So one of the key things, though, is we need to realize that students get extensive methodological training in most disciplines, but it's different from reading it in a textbook to actually visualizing how it will take place in the actual field. So for me, these initial conversations and really helping the student to shape the research topic, that is where it's really an important role for me as a supervisor to help them see the bigger picture, see what qualitative research in this case will allow them to do. And even in this initial meeting, I usually invite them to think about the entire project, not just the topic and identifying the problem and formulating the research question, but also asking them to explain to me how they envision on answering that research question, how they envision on embarking on this study. And a lot of times, I know in sociology, in my discipline, students would say to me, oh, I'll use semi-structured interviews because it's quite a dominant data collection method, for instance. But perhaps their topic is allowing other methods to come in. And it is during these conversations, I say to them, I want you to go and read a little bit more on this particular method or that one, and write down what you think this data collection method will allow you to do in terms of your particular research topic. And this is a time for them to just initially reflect on where they want to go with their study. Remember, in a proposal, and I think in most faculties, students embarking on studies need to present a proposal. And this is not set in stone when it comes to qualitative research, because qualitative research is an iterative process. It can change. But this initial, I want to almost call it blueprint, is really important for the student to start envisioning how the study can go about, even though it can be adapted, and also whether or not, well, me as a supervisor can see that it's really a doable study. So from a very early stage, I ask my students to draw mind maps, think about different possibilities in terms of the methodology, in terms of sampling processes, and this will kind of, like I said, paint that picture a little bit better. But one of the key things, of course, is to help guide a student to formulate an appropriate research question. So in qualitative research, these questions will look different to quantitative research. It will perhaps be a how question or a why question, and it will usually be more open-ended because the aim is not necessarily to test a hypothesis, of course. It is rather to, if you're doing grounded theory, for instance, you want to build a theory. Or if you're doing phenomenological research, you want to study a particular phenomenon. But it needs to be phrased in what I call qualitative language. Now, again, this is difficult, even I have to admit, for myself sometimes to formulate a really clear research question. So in these initial discussions, after I've spoken to the student about their views about qualitative research, I then tell them to take an hour, go sit in another room away from the supervisor, and just formulate at least 5 questions. And oftentimes, only 2 of those really fall within a qualitative phrasing, so to speak. But it's a good starting point. From there on, the supervisor can help brainstorm how it can be phrased in different ways so that it is researchable, so that it is clear, so that it is focused. Now, a good research question, of course, should not be too broad, especially with qualitative research, because as I mentioned earlier, the aim of qualitative research is not to generalize. That shouldn't be the aim at all. it then means that the research question cannot be phrased in such a way that it almost, let's say, includes the entire population of South Africa, for instance. No, it gives one snapshot into a particular group of individuals, and anybody reading that research question should know exactly, take away from it exactly what the student wants to answer. So this is again a process, and research questions can change, but at least if the essence is there, then we can continue with this particular study. So I keep speaking about the language of qualitative studies, and I hear oftentimes that my students refer to respondents. And I think that is because some of them had training in quantitative research. And I say, let's get certain things clear, right? Let's get the language clear. And the first thing, for instance, is that the people who you are collecting data from is not merely responding to a survey. In qualitative research, they are participating in an interview process or whatever the case may be. Of course, it depends if you're doing archival work, it's different. We can discuss that later. But if you are, for instance, gathering information through interviews or focus groups, you need to also consider your participants as human subjects, participants, not objects. That is the difference between qualitative and quantitative studies. And another thing to also consider, I have quite a few PhD students who work from a feminist epistemological position. So that would also inform how they call their participants. In fact, some of the students refer to participants rather as co-knowledge producers, because that fits into the feminist epistemology. So all these considerations is what I initially discuss with students so that they can start envisioning how they need to approach this, but also how they need to write about it in the proposal. So just going back to the research question again, anytime there's anything to do with the extent to which, or the relationship between, or the impact on, then we are going into dangerous territory. Then it sounds like you want to really engage with a quantitative study. So again, it is important to think more of it in terms of open-ended, how, why, what type of questions, because you don't want to hypothesize. Rather, you might want to conceptualize something or understand something. And that also means that the verbs that individuals use, especially in the problem statement, is more in terms of describing, discovering, or even interrogating a specific phenomenon. So people say there's no measuring that takes place in qualitative research, and certainly there isn't in the same sense as quantitative research. We know that in quantitative research, we have numbers, we have statistics, but in qualitative research, there's also two important concepts or terms that students need to realize very early on, and that is that conceptualization is important, and that refers to how a specific term is used. For instance, if I'm doing a study on heteronormativity, I will conceptualize it by looking at different ways that authors have defined it, and then I, as the student, will identify how I will be using it. But then, in a sense, how do you identify it? I don't want to use the word measure, that's why it's in inverted commas, but you still need to identify whether or not you are actually witnessing what you just conceptualized. And that is where operationalization comes in. So that is where you identify, let's say, a few key or identifying factors that will actually help you to identify what you are addressing. And I'm going to use a very simplistic example. When I was doing my master's, I was looking at stigma and lesbian identities. And this was many, many years ago, and a lot of the books that I consulted to try and conceptualize it for my own study refer to lesbian women as women who love women. Very problematic because we're talking about a sexual identity, but that definition is extremely simplistic. And as a heterosexual woman, I love women as well. I love my sister, I love my mother, those type of things. So there were limitations in terms of how that particular term was being used. So I said, no, no, for me, it is about how a woman feels about the same sex sexually and romantically. So in terms of operationalization, it then means that it needs to be a woman who is attracted to other women romantically or sexually, just breaking it down. And this is just once again something that needs to happen early on for a student to get a clear idea of their particular research topic. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are absolutely so many different approaches to qualitative research. Um, we know that anthropologists loves doing ethnographic work, for instance, where you fully immerse yourself, where there's a lot of observation that takes place. In sociology, we also use ethnographic studies, and I did my PhD, and as was mentioned earlier, I was privileged enough to get a scholarship that allowed me to do 3 years of field work. 3 years of ethnographic work where I was able to follow 15 participants for 3 years. You really get to know your research participants in that way. But the reality is we cannot always, as students cannot always do ethnographic studies due to time constraints. We know that faculties are really strict with the amount of time they have to finish a particular study. I'm not saying it's impossible, not at all. I think if the research topic calls for it, there is an argument that can be made to use ethnographic work and a longer amount of time spent in the field, for instance. But if that is not a reality, if it's not realistic for a student, I will advise them to, for instance, look at other approaches. There might be a particular topic that is under-researched, or there's a gap in literature, and there's not a lot of theories around it. So maybe a grounded theory could work better because that will allow the student to then develop a theory at the end of data collection. But I must say, a lot of students use a phenomenological approach where they look at the lived experiences of individuals and try to understand the nuances around a particular phenomenon. And then, of course, you also get situations where you can do case studies, either a single case study or multiple case studies, and allowing the student to then tell a particular story of a particular, let's say, organization or even a school. I've had a few students do case studies on primary schools, for instance. And that can also be very powerful. But again, going back to what the initial fitting research topic is, what the research question is, that will guide the particular qualitative design that the student wants to explore. So, I mean, as much as I say that qualitative research is quite an iterative process, which it is, and it's not as systematic as quantitative research, I do work in a little bit of systems in the sense that I want my student to first have qualitative design in mind before we get to the second part, and that is when to use which type of data collection methods. And we know that in qualitative research, a lot of students use interviews. It is really the easiest way to answer the research question, but there are different types of interviews, and the student should know why they are using, for instance, a structured interview, a semi-structured or unstructured. If you cannot envision as a student that this will allow you to answer your research question, then you need to go to plan B. Clearly, this is not your plan A, right? And then I always tell my students that an interview is basically a conversation with a purpose. That is essentially what it is. And there is back and forth between you and the research participant. And again, your choice will be dependent on the research topic. Of course, focus groups can also be used, very helpful, and I've used quite a few in my time. Oh, I sound so old. But yeah, which is basically group discussions. And this is used when the research topic is calling for diverse perspectives. Now, in my line, I have done quite a few studies that's quite sensitive, meaning that participants don't always want to share something. This in particular, this was about their sex lives. They didn't really want to share that because they felt it's private. So in that case, I would rather opt for an interview, a one-on-one interview, rather than a focus group, so that it can actually allow participants to share their views without feeling judged or without feeling reserved about talking about something that's very private. But if it's not that sensitive and um, you really do want individuals to kind of bounce ideas off one another, focus groups can be wonderful. So then observations. Of course, there's different types of observations. We have participant and non-participant observation. Um, I just read a study where there was a student who just looked at, and this was non-participant observation. There were a few posters on a campus, not this campus, about a queer group that has formed. And she was sitting just watching people's reactions to these posters, how long they lingered, how they pulled their faces, or whatever the case may be, the nonverbal. And she was jotting down in her field notes these observations. But of course, she didn't get involved. She wasn't, she was a non-participant. But for instance, if you are doing ethnographic work, you're probably going to be a participant observer because you are really entering the natural setting, so to speak, of your participants. And they are aware, of course, that you are a researcher. And we will speak about reflexivity and positionality a bit later. But again, with observations, I ask students not to just say they want to use it. Why? Students need to be able to justify why they use certain data collection methods. Um, and I will reflect on a paper I wrote later where I was studying heterosexual identities. This is a taken for granted identity. Participants often do not question it, and that makes it very difficult for the researcher to actually answer the research questions. So for me, something that was a really helpful tool was using participant observation because it allowed me to see how my participants interact with one another, especially people of the opposite sex, because I was looking at heterosexual identities. And that informed how I asked certain questions. That informed the type of thinking that went into how to approach this very normalized identity. And again, being a qualitative researcher, you're really engaging with your participants, and there is a form of knowledge sharing that takes place. Because in my particular study, participants ended up saying to me, wow, Letitia, we started by thinking you're crazy. Why are you looking at heterosexual identities? There's nothing wrong with heterosexuality, which is again a normalized statement, right? And a heteronormative statement. And towards the end of our time spent together in the field, they said, I have a completely different idea of my sexual identity, the impact I have on other people, and how I shape certain behaviors and experiences amongst people of the opposite sex. So it was a learning experience in a sense for both myself to answer the research question, but also self-reflexive for the participants. So I always want students to think much deeper than just saying that a data collection method is a tool. What will it allow them to do? And of course, if the topic asks for a document analysis, you know, existing documents and records can be reviewed and analyzed. And then there will be a particular type of analytical strategy that goes with that. For instance, if you are using archival work. So some tips I've picked up for effective data collection. So once the students have now decided on whichever tool they are going to use or method, I mean, there are important, I would say, guidelines, even though there's not like a clear-cut recipe on how to do this. There are certain guidelines, and one of them I would say is there needs to be some sort of rapport with the research participants. A form of trusting understanding between you and your research participant. So what I've found with a lot of my students recently is they're very scared to engage with their participants for whatever reason. Some are shy, some were scared about their own positionality, and I'll go into that. So that is, I always say to them, that's fine. Let's write it down in your field notes. What is keeping you back? What is holding you back? And a lot of them would say to me, it's all good and well to hear you teach how to give an interview in class. But now that I'm actually going into the field, I realize I'm not sure I can do this. And the thing is, we all start somewhere. We were all novices. And I invite my students to get out of their comfort zone, to remember what the purpose is, the bigger picture. What do you want to achieve? Um, we know with master's research, it doesn't need to be an original contribution per se, but I always tell my students there needs to be some form of a contribution that you are making. In PhD, of course, PhD studies, there needs to be some form of original contribution, but that is the bigger picture, right? And that is where students should be working towards. So in these cases where I get, oh, and by the way, I try and do role playing in classes when I teach research methodology. I think that seems to have worked a little bit better where I have these mock interview guides and students interview one another. I think that has been very helpful. But again, it's a different story when you're now alone and independent, um, needing to go out into the field. So my most recent student, she had two issues. She said that she's shy. And I said again, remember, an interview is just a conversation with a purpose. So try and think of it as that. And her second issue was she was fully aware of who she was interviewing. She was interviewing, she herself is a Black African young woman in her early 20s, and she was interviewing Black African, much older women. And she was saying to me, I'm scared that I'm not going to show them the respect that they deserve. And I said, well, think about it in terms of how you would speak to them in any setting outside of research. You will show certain signs of respect. And I've read her transcripts. I can see that she uses terms such as mama and whatever this person's name is. So she's showing respect even in the interviews. And I said, that's perfectly fine. You can't suddenly, an interview process is not suddenly this very objectivist space, right? There is still people with different biases, people with different positionalities, and that is really important to bear in mind and, of course, take note of in the field notes. So students do need a little bit of encouragement, I have to admit, but once they at least get over the first hump or interview somebody they feel the most comfortable with or they have the most rapport with, then it starts to get fun for them. Because I mean, people are sharing their stories, and that is what we want to do as researchers, tell people stories. So another important thing I try and ensure is that students really need to remember the ethics in practice. In every research proposal, there's usually a section when you're working with human subjects, of course, where you need to envision certain ethical issues that might come about. But it's much different when you're in the field. And I have to say that I draw a lot on my own experiences in trying to guide my students. For instance, a lot of methodological textbooks focuses a lot on not harming the research participant, and that's very important. We have certain things in place for that. For instance, if there is any type of trauma that comes up during an interview, then they can be referred to somebody, all these things. But what these methodology textbooks often overlook is the role of the researcher and the ethics around that. So, for instance, certain contexts where students are going into can be very volatile. And I want students to be aware of that. So it's about the researcher's safety as well. I think it's really important. A lot of students want to do or explore subjects that is very close to their heart. Either they've experienced it themselves or witnessed it in their own lives. For instance, sexual abuse. I have a lot of students working on issues around GBV. But I always tell them that you need to safeguard your own feelings as well. So, for a lot of them, I would advise them after the field or even during the fieldwork phase to get debriefed, to go speak to somebody. I mean, mental health is really, really important as well as physical health. So, the paper I'm going to speak to in just a bit, in my PhD studies, I was harassed. I was touched without my consent because the space I was doing the research in was nightclubs, these high-end nightclubs. And it was really telling about how men interpreted me in that space and how they wanted to touch me, but also what impact does it have on the researcher? And what impact does that have on when you're writing up the findings? There needs to be a clear sense, and I always invite my students to keep organized field notes. Okay, sorry, there we go. So I asked them to maintain detailed and organized field notes. This will help them in writing up their reflexive notes, but it will also help them as researchers to know where they're at mentally. So in my case, I remember doing the PhD, speaking to my supervisor and saying that I'm feeling extremely uncomfortable in these spaces. And I was told just to push forth because you need to get this PhD. I don't think that's the best advice. And I don't think as a supervisor, we need to just overlook these things. We can always find a way. I would have ended immediately in that space. I did try other things. I tried to get a male colleague who was doing his MA to kind of be my research assistant and to come with me to these spaces, which worked a little bit. But on the other hand, I had to acknowledge that it can also have an impact on the gender dynamics that's taking place. So I think eventually I just called it quits and said enough is enough in this space. And students need to speak these things through with their supervisor. We spend an enormous amount of time with our students, and in as much as they need to build up rapport with their participants, which is important, we need to have a certain understanding with our students as well. So I would say that I would invite my students to have an open, conversation with me about what they are feeling as well in the field. So in terms of data analysis strategies, again, the importance here is students need to be able to justify why they are using certain techniques. In sociology, my discipline, I know that a lot of students just immediately jump to thematic analysis because it is quite popular. And I guess some believe that it's easier to do a thematic data analysis, but sometimes the study and the topic calls for something different, maybe a discourse analysis, content analysis, um, narrative analysis. I've got students who are doing life history approaches. And again, a life history qualitative study has a very particular purpose. It wants to trace people's moments in their lives and how these particular milestones or setbacks shaped their view about something currently. If you just want to look at a particular phenomenon at this very moment and just describe what people are experiencing, then don't use a life history approach, for instance. But with life history interviews, and I usually ask my students to use diaries as well, a narrative analysis is really helpful. So again, it needs to be fitting, excuse me, fitting to the design of your study, as well as the data collection tools that will be used. So in terms of software, I know that everybody knows that with quantitative research, there's like SPSS and all types of software that helps to code large numbers of data. With qualitative research, we have smaller groups, but that's not always the case. There are situations where students will be collecting quite a lot of data using qualitative research. And in those cases, when it's quite large, I do invite students to look into certain software tools such as Vivo or Atlas TI, whatever's available at the particular institution. I believe there's even free online tools at the moment. And one student said to me, "But ma'am, am I not cheating?" I said, "No, because these programs are only allowing or helping you to code. You still need to paint in the different, the meat, so to speak, on the skeleton." So I don't necessarily feel it's my job as a supervisor to train them in using Atlas TI, for instance. I mean, even with the RCD, on Moodle, there are videos, there's training sessions, but I do invite my students, if they're really interested, they need to educate themselves on it, and I can help guide them further. So another helpful tip, in as much as students often find it, how can I say, daunting to go into the field, they often don't know what to do once they're now transcribing interviews, for instance, whether it's focus group or one-on-one. Where to now, ma'am? And I usually ask my students to provide me the first 2 or 3 transcripts. I would then read it and, jot down a few themes or whatever the case or codes that's popping out to me, and then meet with them and ask them to talk me through it, because you are not going to expect a reader to read the transcripts. You need to make sense of these transcripts, and you need to, as I always say, use your words. So what is popping up? What is new that wasn't initially in your literature review or whatever the case may be? And this is just a starting point for them to start thinking about how to analyze their transcripts. So qualitative research needs to basically read like a story. You start off in chapter 1 by saying, this is, what I did, and this is why I did it. And the literature review is basically a bit of background as to what has been done and how it has informed my thinking around this study. And the methodology chapter is where the student should tell the reader exactly how they went about in collecting data, how they went about in justifying the type of research design that they used. So I always tell my students, try and avoid sounding like a textbook, because I can pick up a textbook and read what qualitative research is. I want the student to write their study, their particular unique study, into their choice of methodology. Why was a qualitative research design the most appropriate design for this particular study, and bring in, especially in the first section of the methodology chapter, definitely bring in the study topic as well as the problem statement. This is really important. And with qualitative research, and of course, I'm not going to go into too much detail, you also have to explain how entrance was gained, so sampling issues, that you use purposive sampling and why, and the justification for the data collection methods used. But with qualitative research, one of the important key things is that the researcher needs to be reflexive. So that means that the student needs to reflect on their own influence or biases in the research. And this happens before, when you're still formulating the problem, during when you are doing the field work, and then after when you are writing up the findings. So that is where field notes, once again, is so important. And I invite students from the beginning to think about who they are. I have a male master's student, for instance, and he's looking at OnlyFans, women on OnlyFans. And he needs to be fully aware that as a man in this particular profession, how is he being viewed? Usually as a paying customer. So how do you overcome those bridges? And once the student has actually done the field work, they need to now reflect back on how they dealt with certain issues. So I did recently publish a paper on participant observation. And I said that it can, as I mentioned earlier, it can be very helpful, but being in the field can also be difficult. And a lot of methodology books do not address this. So I tried to do this in this paper, but I also speak to the topic of my study, researching heterosexual identities, which, as I mentioned, is a normative identity. So how did this data collection tool help me? But in this paper, and that's where I want to bring in reflexivity, is I was able to reflect on my own experiences in the field. And I'll give an example. In my ethnographic work, I had to, and this is another paper, I went to a sex toy party. So it's nothing as raunchy as people think, people having sex. No, it is like an old school Tupperware party where there's only women. And instead of Tupperware being sold, it's sex toys like vibrators and dildos. And I remember the first time I walked into the room and seeing a table full of sex toys, and I blushed. And everybody was giggling, and I started giggling with all my participants. And I wrote later in my field notes, why was this? I had to really go deep into, like, what was it about what I was seeing that really had such an effect on me and the participants around me, because we were all there participating together, looking at these objects. And I eventually came to the conclusion that it was, to me, quite foreign objects, that in my growing up, in my background, it was always said that women shouldn't really explore things like this in terms of sexual pleasure. So I started to paint a picture in my head, writing down in my field notes where I'm coming from. And then when I started having interviews with the women who participated at these parties, we found similarities with one another. We realized that indeed we've been told the same messages. Indeed, that there are certain limitations. And it helped me then to shape a more robust argument about female sexuality and what informs it. So reflexivity is definitely not saying you cannot have any biases. It's about how you are aware of these biases and how you can actually use it in the process, with your participants and when you are writing up. So hopefully this paper does share a little bit more of a how-to guide for novice researchers and even, experienced researchers. Another space I reflect on is the opposite of the sex toy party, and that is a braai, a typical braai in South Africa. Who hasn't been to a braai? And I was interested in looking at the gender dynamics at these braais. It was mostly attended by heterosexual men and women. And for me, I had to be aware of what I'm used to, also realizing that I come from a different generation than most of these participants. They were quite younger than me. And just being aware of your own positionality, that power dynamic between researcher and the one being researched, but also being open to seeing new forms of dynamics coming about. And that is where my field notes was really helpful again. So, writing and presenting qualitative data and findings, I encourage my students to think of quite descriptive and creative headings. It's qualitative research. So, as I mentioned, it's almost like you're telling a story. So, I I don't want a student just to use, for instance, a quote that they found out of their transcripts without a description of what this quote means. So I would usually say to them, add a colon and just explain what you want to say. So, excuse me, once my students have written up the entire dissertation or thesis, I usually start by going through that table of contents and seeing whether each heading is kind of like telling a logical story, and is it telling the full story? I had a student who just wrote the other day work experiences. I said it's not really telling me anything in line with your particular study. So think a bit more creatively. This is the opportunity to do so. And students need to be guided, I think, a lot of times on what are the appropriate direct quotes that should appear in the actual writing up of the dissertation or thesis. I mean, if somebody just said something like, I was bored. Yeah, I was just bored. That's not really a nice direct quote. If somebody used some punchy words, some words that's really pointing out the themes, then I would say highlight those. These are the type of direct quotes that you need to include in your dissertation. But there needs to be a good balance. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I often tell students, you don't want the reader to guess anything. You have to spell it out for them. They also should not be reading your transcript. So you can't have an entire page, for instance, of one direct quote from your research participant. No, you need to have a good balance so that the flow of the reading is also very well. So maybe a really punchy direct quote, and then you can have some in-text quotes that will also be in inverted commas, or you can just paraphrase it. If I use the same example, Letitia said she was very bored instead of just using it as the direct quote. So it's just finding a good balance. And how I often try and help my students in achieving this is I have a few really good past master's and PhD theses. And I would say to them, it doesn't even necessarily have to be in line with their particular topic, because qualitative research, the recipe in terms of writing it up is quite similar. I would just give them a dissertation to read and say, please read. It's so important to read and just see how other people have done it. It just helps in visualizing what you are going to do and how you are going to do it. So it's all good and well to have nice quotes, but then it also needs to be interpreted or presented in a particular way and interpreted. In some disciplines, this could happen separately. Like there will be one chapter where there's just a presentation of findings and some interpretation, and then the next chapter could be a discussion of these findings. It depends on preference. I like to weave in both, but I mean it is up to the discipline and what the department wants. So I did have a colleague who did a mixed methods study, and she was super um, comfortable with quantitative research, but she was doing a mixed methods, and it was really necessary in her case for the topic. So she came to me and she said, but now what do I do with the qualitative data? I know what to do with the quants, but qualitative data, what do I do? And I took So this is just to acknowledge her work. I took what she had done, and she had quite a large sample of qualitative research participants. And I just took one example of this 59-year-old widowed woman. And I say, so this is what you do. You first tell the story of the participant. If it's a smaller sample, of course, I would propose giving the participant a pseudonym to keep confidentiality. But if it's, I think there was about 60 qualitative research participants, then it's not necessarily, you can't really build them into your story as prominently as it would with a smaller sample. So in this case, the identifying factor was how old the woman was, and that she's widowed and where she's from. You tell the story, and in this case, we had a nice quote that I entered there. And then the student needs to make sense of it, like interpret it, not repeat what the person had said, but rather kind of raise it to a higher level in terms of this particular context. And in this context, the focus was on people living with HIV in Zambia who is on ART. So trying to see whether their lives have improved, what changed, etc. And then I would usually, if you're bringing in the discussion into this chapter, this is the way it could be done. Reflecting on literature, statistics show that over 65% of people living with HIV on ART do in fact not change their lifestyles, which results in blah, blah, blah. It was just merely an example. So this is how, when my students get stuck, I try and take from their transcripts. I would say, let's take a quote. I want the participants' names or pseudonyms in this case, or identifying factors to come through, whether it's in brackets or whether it's written into the actual sentence, because the reader wants to know who the participants are. And then I go through this exercise with them. Tell the story, interpret, and discuss. So, of course, this is breaking it down. Once it's written up, it will look more like this. There won't be little mini headings, tell the story, interpretation, discussion in between. So this is a helpful tool that I think has allowed me to guide students in terms of how to present their qualitative data. But some additional tips. As I keep mentioning over and over again, qualitative research is really about telling a coherent story. And it really is important to guide our students to use signposting. So for instance, they must have their own authoritative voice and say that I am aware that this and this research has been done. However, this study is particularly interested in A, B, C, and Y. So this helps the reader to follow the logic, the thinking behind where the study is coming from. And I think that is an important tool to learn, and one I only learned towards the end of my PhD. I think even after my PhD, when I was writing up, and I had a mentor who said to me, "But why aren't you saying what you were doing? Just say it." And once I started working that into my papers, etc., I mean, there's just a lovely flow, and I try and help students reach that level. Of course, there's another level that students need to reach, more so with PhD students, but also with master's students. And that is a critical level of argumentation. So it's all good and well to tell a story, to interpret it and discuss it. But what does it all mean? I always go, so what? Within the larger scheme of things, what is it saying? If you are looking at agency, female sexual agency within OnlyFans, for instance, what is it then telling about these types of ambiguous agencies? You know, I try and give students a few readings again that would help them do that. I know students struggle to read sometimes in the sense of they say it can be quite overwhelming, and they are under a lot of pressure to get their own work done. But I do believe in the power of example, and I do believe that you know, guiding them in terms of giving them the resources to actually go and read a bit further will help them in their own studies. Seeing the golden thread. As I mentioned, it's all about telling a cohesive story, and there needs to be a cohesive thread from the introduction to the conclusion. This is oftentimes also difficult for students to do, but that is where we as supervisors also come in to try and help them weave this golden thread together from the beginning to the end. And I can say a lot on the golden thread. I just quickly wanted to go back to, I wanted to mention about pseudonyms in qualitative research. I think it's really important, not just for confidentiality, but for the reader to identify who is this student talking about. They must almost become a character in a story. And a tip I give my students, and this does not always work. In fact, it hasn't always worked for me either, is I tell students to ask their participants to choose their own pseudonym. So when I was doing my master's, I don't know why, but I think Rihanna was really big back then because every single woman participant wanted to be Rihanna. So that didn't work. I think one of the participants I called Rihanna, but the rest I said, no, that's not going to work. And the same with my PhD. Every single male participant, black male participant, wanted to be called Kanye because Kanye was before Ye, whatever his name is now. Yeah, he was very popular back then. So it doesn't always work. I do want to give them some form of agency. But if that doesn't work, I say, I hear you. I like Kanye, but can't you think of a name that is more telling about who you are and what you represent as an individual? So you are just having a conversation, and usually that works much better. But then also choosing a pseudonym, there's an art to it because I can't, for instance, choose a pseudonym that says Tembisa because maybe Tembisa is seen as a Black African female name and not a Afrikaans white woman as myself. So the name needs to kind of correspond in a way with the identity markers of the participants, because again, it will allow the reader to understand where this particular participant is coming from. Because when we're dealing with human beings, of course, we are dealing with different identity markers, and it helps the storyline, so to speak. So that is my story. I know that this session is going on not that long, but I also want to open it to the floor and hear if anybody has questions, or even if you want to share some of your experiences in supervising qualitative research. But I thank you. Thanks so much. Have we lost our facilitator? Thanks, Evajoy. Oh,
I'm here,
hi.
Dr. Smart. I thought maybe participants they will have questions to ask or use the chat, but it seems like we don't have any question at the moment.
Let's give it a moment. If there's anybody who would like me to go over something again, I can do that as well. All right. Karen.
Hi, Dr. Smuts. Thank you so much for such a generous and accessible presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm a literary scholar, but I work within an education department, and so I have to supervise work outside of my field, and so I'm very grateful for the tips that you gave.
Pleasure.
I was wondering because you spoke about thematic analysis and how that's usually where we go, and it certainly is where a lot of education research goes. But I was wondering about your view on narrative and discourse analysis, and when you think, because that certainly to me is a more interesting approach, and when you think that's appropriate. Because I imagine it would be very appropriate in sociology research, but I think it could feature a bit more in education research too.
I think so. And I think I love it when students explore different techniques because I'm also learning out of the process. For instance, I have a student who is now doing content analysis because she's looking at social media. And I did content analysis as an undergrad in communication studies. So I kind of know the textbook version of it, but not how it can actually work in the field. So her coming back to me with what she's done, I'm really learning so much from it. So I think to bring in that into that discipline, it needs to kind of, people need to be brave enough to kind of explore it a little bit. So yeah, my feeling with thematic analysis is it is useful. We use a lot of Braun and Clark's work. Again, if it's a phenomenological study where you really just want to speak about a specific phenomenon, I think it works very well. But being brave enough to use, for instance, discourse analysis, when the topic is calling for you as the researcher to really look at how people speak about certain things. For instance, heteronormative discourses. That is a space where I can use discourse analysis. And I use various methods that I should have said earlier. With qualitative research, you can use various methods. But I would look, for instance, at how people react on social media, people react on TV, how people speak about certain topics. And with narrative, very useful, not as easy as people think it is. There is definitely a logic behind it, and that is where I look at all my books, and I have so many different books. There's a book here I see that says Writing Women's Worlds. How do you write about women? And they used life histories and narrative data analysis. So again, it really is about exploring, but also linking it to the research question. What will really allow you to answer that research question? I hope that helps.
Thank you, it does.
Karen, is your hand up again?
It is. I'm just taking advantage of the opportunity, if you don't mind. I don't want to dominate the space at all. And so if I'm being a pain, tell me to shut up.
Not at all.
So I have a student who wants to look at, so obviously English instruction is fraught within our spaces. Like the vast majority of our students don't have English as a first language, and often the study of English literature is elitist and exclusionary. And so there's that aspect. So a student of mine wants to study an English module and how it's received. But I suppose what I'm worried about is her just gathering a few opinions. I find that it's just not interesting enough. I would want her to look at how the teaching itself is received and the effect of the teaching. And I wonder if I'm moving with effect of the teaching, like the degree to which.
Yeah.
So is that a direction I should, I mean, given my inexperience, certainly with quant, like I know absolutely nothing. And so would it be better for her and for me to steer her more towards qualitative analysis?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily, because I'm gathering that the student would end up using as a case study, like a particular module. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Oh, perfect. You know what? I think there's ways around it. I wouldn't necessarily phrase the main research question as the effect on, not at all. I would rather maybe say shape, how reactions to the teaching shapes their views about something. But it's definitely a decolonized practice that this student wants to do. So I could actually see this being quite an interesting study. So it's just a matter of, I think, also the language we use. Instead of effect, maybe use shape, or something like that,
Yes,
which
that's
is
helpful.
essentially saying the same thing. But with shape, you are inviting the student to really go in depth and not just saying there's a cause and effect. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like they can really unpack perceptions. And in qualitative research, we can study perceptions. I wouldn't say we study attitudes. Quantitative research, we measure attitudes. To what extent, strongly disagree, that's measuring attitudes. But we can most definitely study perceptions and how that shapes people's identities, reactions, etc. Absolutely. So I think it's possible.
Thank you.
Perfect. Great. And this is an ongoing process. I learn something new with every student. So hopefully we can continue this conversation at another stage as well.
Thank you. Could I ask again, so
Sure.
as an experienced supervisor of qualitative research, are there some primers that you would recommend to me? I have, of course, acted as a co-supervisor, and so a lot of my training comes from just flying by the seat of my pants. But I think I would be grateful just if you could shove me in the direction of some primers that you would recommend. I know like textbooks are a limited resource, but I would be grateful for anything like that.
Well, for me, okay, just in terms of textbooks, and I'm looking at my methodology books up in the shelf there, I use a local textbook usually called Fundamentals of Social Research Methods, and it's by Bless, Hickson Smith, and Satole. And the reason I like this textbook is because they think about the purpose of research. They say that the purpose should not just be to go in and extract information and present it, just for research's sake. It's about training socially responsible researchers. So that's why I love that textbook in particular. But then also, since you're working in the field of education, I would urge you to read any of Professor Anthony Brown's work. He does extremely rich qualitative research. So I think Anthony Brown is also a nice. This is just off the top of my head, but I can always send you some more stuff offline.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Eva Joy, yes.
Hello, Doc. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I just want to agree with you. The way you do it, it's almost like exactly the same way I do it when I'm supervising my students. So like in qualitative research, before anything, I tell the student, like, tell me your story. What is it that you want to do? Exactly, right from the onset. Tell me what it is that you want to do. Because I feel like a lot of students will get lost in trying to translate what they want to do later on. And then they'll mix the methods, like you were saying. Like they will talk about, say, perceptions or looking at some behavior of some sort. And then they want to say, I'm going to do a survey of something, but you're just, so it's like, tell me what you want to do exactly, and then probably I'll help you there and try to choose the correct methods of how to go about. Yes. And it's like your story from the onset, from the introduction, is not independent of anything else. Your objectives, your methods, your analysis, it's a story. You're telling me like I did this and I did that. And so yeah, I feel like, yeah, it was a very good presentation. Thank you so much. And I really relate.
It's a pleasure, and I'm glad that you are relating. It means that we are doing something right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you
Most
so much.
definitely. Pleasure. It's
Yeah.
a pleasure.
Yeah.
And
And also,
yes,
sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to know, like, when it comes to the methods on qualitative research, because myself, I'm into photo voice methodologies, visual methodologies, action research, you know. So, like, when it comes to saying advising students, because at the end of the day, you know, we are all inclined to what we know as supervisors, that we want to lead the students to what we know.
Yeah.
So how do I, like, probably not push them to exactly what I know, you know, because like I end up like seeing most of my students into participatory action research now.
Yeah, no, I understand. And the same in sociology. We do POR as well. Yes, I know. But I think it's our responsibility as a supervisor just to kind of give them an idea of what the method will allow them to do. So, for instance, I know that digital storytelling, it can be very powerful. And there are certain topics where digital storytelling is just more fitting than doing an interview, you know? So, I mean, even though I say we should allow the student to come up with their own ideas, we are there to guide them. So we basically just give them the different options, and they need to think about where they want to go with it. And I think that is the only thing we can do. But since we have the experience, we know that certain methods work well in certain situations. So why not share that knowledge? I think let's practice what we preach and preach what we practice, type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah,
Pleasure.
thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. And whatever Joy was saying, something that popped up there is I had a master's student, and I won't say what the student ended up doing. It was a topic that I was really interested in. So I thought, okay, great. So you really want to do this. But what I didn't realize is she was an extremely shy person. Even our initial conversations, it was difficult to hear from her what she really was all about. But she kept on insisting that this is a topic that she's interested in. But when me and the co-supervisor were reading the writing up of the findings, there was no life. There was nothing coming out. And I asked her, and sadly, this was more towards the end of the study. I said, what is it that really grabbed your attention in terms of this topic? And then she said, it's because you were doing it, you were into it. I said, wow, it's showing. It's showing in the way that you are presenting the work. There's no passion, there's no curiosity. And that was a lesson I learned. I said, from now on, I'm going to ask each and every student from the get-go, what is it that really motivated you to start looking at this topic? Yeah, I think it's helpful. Yes, Everjoy.
Yeah, I just want to come in again with what I do myself before anything. Is like you're allocated students like some time before, like yes. So I tell them initially, before I even engage with them, you need to go and read in the area. Go and read before you start writing, because at the end of the day, you end up like duplicating the research. Go and read and read and read and read and read until you find like what you're thinking. Is there a gap? Is it a gap, or it's a replication? Yeah, so it's like go and read. Take some time before you start writing, or you start thinking about what. It takes a lot of time. Read, and think about. Yeah, that's something else that I do initially before they start even writing.
Very true. I do the same, and I should have mentioned that because it's such a brilliant way for them to, like you say, identify their gap. Where does their research fit in? So I completely agree with you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Rollins, Emmanuel.
Hi, Letitia. Thank you for the wonderful presentation.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak maybe to issues of power dynamics between main supervisor and then the co-supervisor in terms of maybe choosing methods and yeah, because the student might probably agree with the co-supervisor, whereas the main supervisor wants a certain different kind of approach. So how could that be resolved?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And I must say that in my experience, 16 years of doing co-supervision, I've never supervised alone, by the way. We've only done co-supervision. It depends on the individual supervisors involved. So I can now, and I'm in my department, but I can now say, like, there are certain people I work better with than with others. But the key thing with any type of supervisor relationship is to, from the get-go, say, what is my role as a main supervisor and what is your role as a co-supervisor? So what we try to do in our department is the main is usually not necessarily somebody more experienced, but somebody perhaps more specializing in the field that the student wants to go in. And the co can also be an expert or basically fulfill more of a, how can I say, pedantic role of just looking at golden thread. It might not necessarily be what they are focusing on in their own research, because this happens. I mean, at the moment I have over 20 postgrad students. Not all of them are working in my field. So I prefer to work with somebody who's more specialized, and I would like them to be the main and kind of take the leading role. So it is all about communication, and it can sometimes be a little bit of a hit and a miss in terms of how you end up working with one another. But again, open communication. I have even learned from less experienced supervisors. If that makes any sense, it doesn't necessarily have to be the top professor in the department who publishes a lot. In fact, can just be somebody who's closer in your career development or whatever the case may be, because we learn from one another. That should be the key thing. I hope that answers your questions, Emmanuel.
Certainly, yes. Open communication, yeah.
Open communication from the start. And like I said, if things goes a little bit array, like it's not working, I just come out to the supervisor and say, listen, we need to get our relationship right, because this is all about the student. We need to find a middle ground. So nothing bad just yet. I think just being open has been very good.
Yeah.
Great. Eva Joy.
I think maybe following on what you're saying, what Dr. Roland asked, there are times when, for example, if you're supervising online, you're not meeting probably your students. I feel like written communication can be perceived differently, unlike when you're talking to them. So sometimes, like, you feel like there's a discrepancy in the type of supervision. I feel probably you have to approach the student or ask them to call me so that we talk directly. Because, if you're like giving instructions or revising, giving revisions, they might not understand and take it like differently. Or so I feel you need to engage your students verbally and, get yeah.
I agree, to avoid kind of loss in translation, because sometimes, as supervisors, or as the student might interpret it as, oh, my supervisor is being harsh. Meanwhile, that was not the intent at all. That's just one example. So I have to say, I do prefer verbal supervision sessions. Sometimes when it's a student who, you get very independent students, and then you get students who needs a little bit more hand-holding, because I do believe students have different needs, and we as supervisors need to identify that and attend to these needs. And then what I would sometimes do with students that's a bit insecure is I would ask them to just send me a summary of the verbal meeting we just had, highlighting the main things that came out of the supervision session. So it's a way of keeping track for the student as well. But it also helps for the supervisor to know where you are at in the supervision stage. So thank you for sharing that as well. And I think we all have so many different stories. I think we all should be publishing in SOTL or something, you know, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and what we've learned about supervision, because it can be so helpful for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Smart. I have a similar experience with what Eva Joy have said. With my supervisor, I used to think that she was harsh through emails when she was giving feedback and so on. But the time when I met her and when we arranged physical meetings, that's where I realized that no, she's just a good person, and her personality was totally different from what I used to see on email. So I kind of agree with that one.
Yeah, so it made all the difference. I think it's so important. Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's any more questions.
Yes, I think we do not have any questions at the moment. Thank you so much to colleagues. Thank you so much, Dr. Smart, for such an insightful presentation. Very informative. Thank you so much for your taking your time and facilitate today's session. And to all our participants, thank you for taking your time as well. We hope the session met your expectations and you will share with others as well. We will share the presentation as well as the recording to module communities. Thank you so much. I've shared a evaluation link. Please do fill that out in your spare time. It will take only 5 minutes. This helps us in terms of organizing workshops of this kind and to find out if these workshops have impact in your life, or should we give you more of these kind of workshops, as well as to give feedback to our facilitators. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for the invite.
Bye, everyone.